Supervision versus consultation. There are similarities. Supervision can evolve into consultation for senior level professionals to get an idea about how to handle a particularly difficult client or regain needed objectivity. Those of you who used to watch The Sopranos or who watch some of the newer shows in therapy know that even cable TV is showing how therapists can go and get assistance. So if you don't know about something, you can go and get help with it. So that's consultation. Differences are consultation is freely sought and does not have an evaluative component. If you seek consultation about an area you're not that familiar with, you're free to accept or reject whatever the consultant tells you. It's not true of the supervisor. Supervisors, as we'll get into, continue to have the legal and fiduciary responsibility for what happens with that patient. It's their license on the line. Not the supervisee, by definition, does not have a license. As a supervisee, it's also easier to disagree with a consultant than to disagree with a supervisor because of the evaluative component. And within consultation, there is no prescription to be from the same discipline. So more on understanding supervision. There are values that are integral to supervision. These values are, 1, integrity in relationships. 2, an ethical, values-based practice. Number 3, appreciation of diversity in all of its forms. And finally, a science-informed practice. Let's talk about integrity in relationships. We can think about it as moral incorruptibility. And one way of looking at it is any corruption that stems from ethical or boundary violations, supervisory incompetence, or inattention to supervisory responsibilities. All of these will compromise the integrity of the supervisory relationship, and therefore the therapy that the supervisee is conducting. And it can be easy to fall into these ethical and boundary violations, and it's surprisingly easy to be incompetent as a supervisor. So 2 quick examples. All of us know about the ethical and legal prescriptions that govern our relationships with our clients and that govern our relationships with our supervisees. And most of us would not violate those. For example, we know it's illegal and unethical to have sexual relationships with our patients. And the same holds true for our supervisees because of the power differential. So that's not a place we would go. However, it would be easy, let's say we have a supervisee that we like and enjoy, and they're living as a student in like student housing. You live in a fairly nice place, and you're going to go on vacation, and you need someone to water your plants, take care of your cat. It's easy to say to your supervisee, listen, I'm not going to be here for 2 weeks. How's about if you house sit for me? I get somebody who I know is reliable, and you get to stay in a nice place for 2 weeks. I mean, it sounds easy, and it sounds natural. Don't do it. It's an ethical and boundary violation. What if they break your grandma's vase? That could affect how you react to them within supervision. It violates our ethical boundary around multiple relationships. Easy to slide into that. And as we'll see, it's easy to slide into supervisory incompetence. Again, if we have a supervisee that we like, it's easy to say, so tell me about some cases. Well, it is illegal and unethical for us not to get outside information, for not to review tapes, to not to sit with them, and not to watch them. But we'll be getting into that again later. So, second point, an ethical values-based practice. This refers to the very significant, deep, and profound role that supervisors can take in terms of being a role model for their supervisees. Supervisors can assist supervisees in a structured and targeted exploration of values as it impacts human decision-making without slipping into any kind of psychotherapy or counseling. So one example. All of us are aware that in the current healthcare environment, there are limits that insurance places on the number of sessions we can have with some patients. We can model for our supervisees how we pay attention to the realities of our world, that we only have 4 sessions, and within those parameters, how we can avoid making mistakes and falling into sand traps, such as a premature solution, or jumping to a conclusion without enough data because you know you don't have time. That's an ethical problem. And an appreciation, the third point, appreciation of diversity in all of its forms. Our APA ethical guidelines talks about diversity. It's principle E, and if you want you can click on the link, but here it is. Respect for people's rights and dignity. Straight out of the ethical guidelines, it says psychologists respect the dignity and worth of all people, and the rights of individuals to privacy, confidentiality, and self-determination. Psychologists are aware that special safeguards may be necessary to protect the rights and welfare of persons or communities whose vulnerabilities impair autonomous decision-making. Psychologists are aware of and respect cultural, individual, and role differences, including those based on age, gender differences, gender identity, race, ethnicity, culture, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, disability, language, and socioeconomic status, and consider these factors when working with members of such groups. That's a mouthful, and it's a long list. But each of them can affect the relationship and needs to be considered. Psychologists try to eliminate the effort on their work of biases based on these factors, and they do not knowingly participate in or condone activities of others based upon such prejudices. Now, it's not only being aware of our prejudices and stereotypes. It's also how do we use diversity to help us understand the world of our clients. So, for example, as you could tell, I am a proud member of the baby boomer generation. For baby boomers, as a group, we tend to value ourselves based on our work. So if your supervisee is doing therapy with a 58-year-old man who was just laid off because of the poor economic conditions, that's going to have deep, deep resonance for this man because of his age and his relationship to work. That's important to know. It's not a prejudice. It's just important to know that that's part of the patient we're dealing with. Now, according to founder Shafransky, appreciation of diversity must include self-awareness of multiple factors by both the supervisor and the supervisee within the context of the client's presentation. This is viewed as an interactional conceptual process. It's also a very difficult and challenging kind of process because it has multiple components. These components include belief systems, biases, assumptions, values, expectations, and worldviews. So, diversity competent supervision requires that we as supervisors pay attention to the practice of appropriate, relevant, and sensitive assessment and intervention strategies and skills, while taking into account the larger milieu of organizational, social, and socio-political variables. The next point talks about a science-informed practice. Now, integrating science and practice means integrating the knowledge, the skills, and the values that are associated with evidence-based practices and bring those into your conceptualization of what's happening with your client and the treatment choices that you make. So, for example, it would be a proper role for a clinical supervisor to integrate political, religious, and social type perspectives and biases from themselves, their supervisee, and the client in order to better understand and accommodate the needs of the client. One example of this would be there's data out there that for people doing marital therapy, if you as a supervisor and or your supervisee have a belief that divorce is a viable option, then what happens, the data show that the clients that see supervisors and supervisees who believe that, they have a higher incidence of divorce after marital therapy than those clients who see supervisors and supervisees who do not believe that's an option. Now, regardless of whether you think that's a good option or not, it's important to know that that's going to affect the therapy. It also implies, and this is where it gets challenging and difficult, it's necessary for us as supervisors to know our own biases. And I'm going to make the point that that goes beyond race, gender, ethnicity. So, for example, we may assume that a supervisee is less competent than their peers for a variety of extraneous reasons. For example, they come from the same school where a previous difficult supervisee came, and a supervisor may hold some stereotypes and heuristics about the supervisee's ethnic background or chosen psychological specialty. So some people assume that if the supervisee is on a track to become a neuropsychologist, they have no interest in and are fairly incompetent in therapy. Well, that's an assumption. And you may want to check that assumption out. Also, to self-disclose, I've been a supervisor for a number of years. I've had my share of supervisees that were challenging. And I remember being assigned supervisees who came from the same school, and I would roll my eyes and go, oh boy, this is going to be a tough year. And it turned out I was totally wrong. Always check out your assumptions, but in order to check them out, you have to be aware of them. And I'm embarrassed to say that I only knew that I held that assumption when I realized I was wrong. And I was surprised by that. You mean somebody from that school is good? It's like, oh, I must have a thought that that school's not very good and neither are the students. And I was wrong. Or, as a supervisor, for whatever reason, we may be very protective of a particular supervisee and not allow them to achieve appropriate degree of clinical independence. Now, we also talked about the competency of following science-informed practice. If you do it correctly, it can lead to a process of taking a stance of inquiry, learning how to frame questions, engaging in critical thinking, testing hypotheses, and formulating conclusions. Now, if you look at these, inquiry, framing questions, critical thinking, testing hypotheses, and formulating conclusions, that could also be a template for how we can help our supervisees approach an individual client. You have a question. What's wrong with this person? You collect some data. You formulate hypotheses. You rule in and rule out various hypotheses. And you're ruling in and ruling out various diagnoses that go along with those hypotheses and the resulting conceptualizations. And then you test these out, and you look at what interventions there are. So even within individual therapy, you can have a science-informed practice. You're treating it as if it's an N of 1.